Hello, students. Let's look at some more examples. Let's say we want to define a function that removes something from a list. Let's say it removes all occurrences of it from a list. So um, I'll give it a name. I'll say remove I from L. And what's it going to take in? Well, it's going to take in an I and an L. So every instance of I has to get removed. So how are we going to do this? Well, we want this function to work for lists. So let's make it with lists. Uh, how do we get rid of stuff from L? Well, what we could do is we could use a list comprehension. We could say, okay, I want the stuff that's in L already, J for J in L, but I don't want any of those things to be equal to I. So how do we remove stuff when we're creating a list with a list comprehension? Well, we use a filter. So we only want the j's that are not equal to I. So how do we do this? Well, very simply, if j is not equal to I. So let's try this. And Python seemed to think it looks okay, at least. Now let's try to run it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove I from L. And what I'm going to do is let's remove 3 from the list. 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2. And let's see what happens. And it removed every instance of 3. Suppose I try to run it again. Let's try to run this, but let me instead give it a set. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, even though I didn't intend for this to work with sets, it did what it could. It did manage to remove 3, but the output is a list because, you know, I insisted that when I gave it the rules for creating this type of thing. Okay. Note that order does matter. What if I were to try to switch the orders here? Let's shorten this a little bit. But let's say I want, so I know this will work. But let's say I want to now switch the order. I get a type error. So what type of error? Well, int is not iterable. Well, why did I get that error? Well, let's think about it. What am I doing here? Well, I'm taking all the elements that are in L, and I'm including them if they're not equal to I. But now L is the integer 3. It's not a container. It's not an iterable. So the iterables are the things that we can take things out of. We have a 3. I can't take the j in 3 because 3 is not a container. Now, what if I were to make a little bit of a change here? What if I were to do this? Now, why did that happen? You might want to pause the video for a second and think about it if it seems mysterious to you. But now we do have a list. Our L is 3, and what it's doing is it's checking to see whether the list 1, 2, 3, 4, which is our I, happens to be an element of this list. And if it is, it removes it. So it's working exactly as I intended. If I were to stick that list in as an element and create this weird object that has like some lists, so it's a list of numbers and lists. Stick one more of those in there. Okay. What did I do? Well, I removed this thing, which is the list 1, 2, 3, 4, each time it occurred in this list, which it occurred here, here, and here. So working just fine. We might not have intended it to work with lists of lists, but hey, you know, Python will try to make it work as best as it can in all situations. Okay, so that's a nice example, but let's try to do something else. Let's say we want to, I don't know, sum 2 lists. So we have 2 lists, and we want to take the sum of all the things in both of the lists. So sum 2 lists. So I have L1 and L2, or I could call them L and M. And there's some amount of choice here. So, okay. So what I want to do is I want the sum of everything that's in either L, sum of everything that's in L, and the sum of everything that's in L. So these are not sets. I'm not, worried about overlap and things like that. This is just, I'm going to add everything in L. I don't care whether the things in M are the same. I'm going to add those two, and I'm going to add everything together, just adding all over the place. So let's try how can we do this? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the sum of everything in L, and I'm going to add the sum of everything in M. And let us try this as well. So 1, 2, and 3, 4, 5. Beautiful. If I were to try this with sets, it would still work. And if I were to try this with a set and a list, that's fine. Takes more time to type it in than to see, but what is it doing? It's adding everything in here plus everything in here. Okay, let's try another example. Let's try swap. Okay, now what do I want to do from this swap? Well, I want to take in a tuple that has two things and swap the position. So I'm going to take in a tuple that has two things. I'm going to enter. So I'm taking in a single tuple. And what I want to do is I want to return the tuple with the things in the reverse order. So normally the first element is T0 and the second is T1. I want to swap the order. So I could do T1, T0. And let's try this. Let's swap the 9 and 5 in this tuple. Works just fine. Now, what if I did this? Now, you might think that this is going to give us some sort of a syntax error right away, but Python allows it. And it also gives a tuple. Now, remember in math, right, when you have a function, you get a single output, right? This is why, there are issues when we have the square root function. When I ask for the square root of 4, it doesn't give me 2 and -2, right? We have to pick a single thing to get out of that function. So in math, we say, okay, when I see that square root symbol, I'm only going to ask for the positive of the two roots. In Python functions, it's the same thing. We have a single thing, but it looks like I'm returning two things. Well, Python made those two things into a tuple, you'll see. And if we want to be sure that that's what it did, let's try it. A tuple. So if you don't include parentheses with your outputs, but you do use commas, what Python will do is it'll assume you wanted a tuple and it will give you a tuple. I mean, in Python, if I do 5, 6, it creates a tuple by itself. So it's not just something with functions. Just commas, if you leave out the parentheses, Python will say, okay, what does this person want? Well, looks close to a tuple. Let's make it into a tuple. So don't have to worry about that as well if you leave out those parentheses. What happens if I actually were to do this? Just one more thing. Well, now that's an error because this function was written to take in a single tuple, and instead I gave it 2 arguments, and it very clearly tells me that. If I wanted to write this function differently, I could have done it like this. AB, so now it takes in 2 things and returns the tuple BA, and it'll work just fine on 2 different things. So I give it swap 5, 7, but now I can't give it a single tuple. So now if I do swap 5, 7, I've only given it one thing and it's saying, hey, where is the other thing? It's even telling me, hey, this is the argument that I'm missing. I needed an A and a B. I got an A. I did not get a B.